Hello, everyone. Got a few funny jokes for you today. At breakfast, a woman said to her husband, "Honey, I had the wildest dream last night. I dreamt that I saw a diamond necklace. What do you think it means?" The husband thought about it for a moment and answered, "Well, sweetie, maybe you'll find out what that dream means on your birthday." Sometime later, they were having breakfast again, and the wife said, "Honey, I had another dream. I was wearing diamond earrings. What do you think it means?" The husband answered, "Your birthday is even closer now, sweetie, so I bet you're going to find out what that dream means." Another morning at breakfast, the wife said, "Honey, I had a dream last night that someone gave me a diamond tennis bracelet. What do you think this dream means?" The husband answered, "Sweetie, it's your birthday next week, and I promise you'll find out exactly what that dream means." The day before the wife's birthday, she says to her husband, "Honey, I dreamt last night that you gave me a diamond ring. Do you know what that dream means?" The husband answered, "Sweetie, I love you so much, and all I can say is there's only one more day until you find out what all these dreams mean." The next morning at breakfast, the husband gave his wife her birthday present. It was a book, How to Interpret Your Dreams.
So Salim and Habib are beggars who beg in different areas of London. Habib begs just as long as Salim does, but only manages to collect $2 to $3 every day. Meanwhile, Salim brings home a suitcase full of 10-pound notes, drives a Mercedes, lives in a mortgage-free house, and has plenty of money to spend. One day, Habib asks Salim, "I work just as long and hard as you do, so how come you bring home a suitcase full of $10 notes every day?" Salim replies, "It's all in the sign, my friend. What does your sign say?" Habib holds up his sign, which reads, "I have no work, a wife, and 6 kids to support." Salim shakes his head and says, "No wonder you only get $2 to $3. Curious, Habib asks, "So what does your sign say?" Salim shows him his sign, which reads, "I only need $10 more to move back to Pakistan." So Jake was dying, and his wife, Becky, was keeping a candlelight vigil by his side. She held his frail hand, tears streaming down her face. Her praying roused him from his slumber. He looked up, and his pale lips began to move slightly. "My darling Becky," he whispered. "Hush, my love," she said. "Rest now. Don't talk." But he was insistent. "Becky," he said in a tired voice, "I have something I must confess to you." "There's nothing to confess," replied the weeping Becky. "Everything's all right. Just go to sleep." "No, I must die in peace. I slept with your sister, your best friend, her best friend, and your mother." "I know," Becky whispered softly. "That's why I poisoned you."
An elderly man was lying on his deathbed, surrounded by his family. As his eyesight began to fail, he turned to the doctor and asked, "Is my wife here?" The doctor smiled reassuringly. "Yes, she's right here." The old man continued, "And my sons? Are my beautiful sons here?" "They're here too," the doctor replied. "What about my sister?" "She's here," the doctor said. "Your brother-in-law is here as well. Your entire family is by your side, so just relax and don't worry about anything." The old man slowly sank back into his pillow and closed his eyes. After a moment, he suddenly opened them and said, "If everyone is here, why is the light still on in the kitchen?"
A guy was telling his buddy about a woman he was dating. "I'm dating this really unusual Turkish woman," he said. "Her mother is Tunisian, her father is Canadian, one of her grandparents is Albanian, and her half-brother is Danish." His buddy looked at him with a serious expression. "Dude, you need to break up with her." The guy was confused. Why? His buddy shook his head. Too many red flags. A man went to the hospital to visit his mother-in-law, who was in serious condition. When he gets home, his wife asks, "Well, how is she doing?" He says, "Apparently, she's doing great. She's going to get out of the hospital and live with us for decades." "Amazing," says the wife. "But I don't understand. Yesterday, the doctor said she only had a few days to live." And the husband says, "Well, I don't know about yesterday, but today the doctor told me to prepare for the worst." A company's CEO decided to buy an AI system to identify the company's most replaceable employee. The AI analyzed 5 years of emails, meetings, salaries, and performance reviews. After processing all the data, the AI finally announced its answer. The most replaceable employee is the CEO. The CEO was furious and immediately demanded to know who had installed the AI. The IT guy raised his hand. He was fired for installing defective software.
An Englishman, a Frenchman, a hot young blonde, and an old lady are seated together in a train compartment. The train goes into a tunnel, and the compartment goes completely dark, at which point a loud slap is heard. When they emerge from the tunnel, the Frenchman is rubbing his jaw. The old lady thinks, "Oh my, the Frenchman must have gotten handsy with the young lady, so she slapped him. Good for her." The young blonde thinks, "The Frenchman must have tried to get forward with me, but groped the old lady instead, so she slapped him." The Frenchman thinks, "That English pig must have touched the blonde girl inappropriately, and she thought it was me, so she slapped me." And the Englishman thinks, "I hope we go through another tunnel so I can slap the Frenchman again." A postman was retiring after 30 years on the job. On his last day, he was walking slowly from house to house, putting mail through the slots of the homes he delivered to. After putting some mail through the slot of a nice, big house, he heard the door open. He turned around and saw a lady standing there in a negligee. She took him by the hand and led him upstairs. She made love to him for an hour, then took him downstairs and fed him a nice, big breakfast. As he was walking out the front door onto the porch, she handed him an envelope. He opened it and found a $20 bill inside. He looked at her and said, "Lady, I've been a postman for 30 years. Nothing like this has ever happened to me before. What's going on?" The lady said, "I told my husband last night that you were retiring and maybe we should do something nice for you." He said, "And what did he say?" The lady replied, "He said, screw him, give him $20. The breakfast was my idea."
A man walks into a bar and orders a whiskey with no ice. He drinks it straight in one shot. Then he turns to the bartender and asks, "Excuse me, do you know how tall penguins are?" The bartender looks confused. "I don't know, maybe half a meter?" The man orders another whiskey, drinks it straight, and asks, "And what would be the tallest a penguin can be?" The bartender, even more confused, replies, "Probably a meter." The man orders another shot, drinks it straight, and looks at the bartender. "Then I think I ran over a nun."
So a cowboy rode into town and stopped at a saloon for a drink. Unfortunately, the locals had a habit of picking on strangers, which he was. When he finished his drink, he found his horse had been stolen. He goes back into the bar, casually flips his gun into the air, catches it without looking, and fires a shot into the ceiling. "Which one of you sidewinders stole my horse?"
he yelled with surprising force. No one answered. "All right," he said, "I'm gonna have another beer, and if my horse ain't back outside by the time I finish, I'm gonna do what I did in Texas. And trust me, I don't like doing what I did in Texas." Some of the locals shifted nervously. He had another beer, walked outside, and sure enough, his horse was back. He saddles up and starts to ride out of town. The bartender follows him outside and asks, "Say, partner, before you go, what happened in Texas?" The cowboy turns back and says, "I had to walk home."
So, a man and his wife went to a livestock auction and looked at a farmer's selection of breeding bulls. The first pen had a sign that read, "This bull made it 50 times last year." The man's wife playfully nudged him and said, "Wow, that's almost once per week." They walked to the second pen, which had a sign that read, "This bull made it 150 times last year." The man's wife jabbed him a bit harder and said with a smirk, "Goodness, that's more than twice a week. You could learn a lot from him." They walked to the third pen, which had a sign that read, "This bull made it 365 times last year." The man's wife aggressively elbowed him in the ribs and exclaimed, "That's once a day. You could really learn something from this one." Annoyed, the man turned to his wife and said, "Go over and ask the farmer if every time was with the same old cow."
So a college professor was handing out the final exam when he heard a knocking from the entrance. A very drunk student was leaning against the door jamb and asked, "Hey, professor, will you let a drunk student take the exam?" The professor looked up at the plastered specimen, sighed, and said, "Yes, all right." The student nodded hugely, then leaned outside the door and said, "Okay, boys, drag 'em in."
So one day, a man bought a lie-detecting robot that would slap anyone who lies. He's sitting in his living room when his son walks in the front door. The dad asks, "Where you been, son?" The son replies, "I went to watch the new Kung Fu Panda movie." The robot comes and slaps the son. So dad says, "Son, the robot slaps anyone who lies. Now tell me the truth." So his son finally admits, "Dad, I actually went to watch an R-rated film. I'm sorry." So dad starts scolding him, saying, "Is this how we raised you, son? Watching filth in your age? I have never anything like this at your age." The robot comes and slaps the dad. Seeing this, the mom walks in and says, "What did you expect? He's your son after all." So the robot comes and slaps the mom. A woman walks into a bar and orders a whiskey on the rocks. The bartender grabs a glass, scoops up a handful of ice, and starts making the drink. "Wait a minute," the woman says. "I don't know where those hands have been. Could you use the tongs, please?" The bartender gives her a funny look, but shrugs and obliges. A few minutes later, the woman notices a string hanging from the bartender's zipper. "Excuse me," she says, "I don't want to be rude, but you have a string hanging from your zipper." "Oh, that's just so when I go to the bathroom, I can pull it out without having to touch anything," he explains. "That way, I don't need to wash my hands." The woman nods. "I guess that makes sense." She goes back to enjoying her drink, but after a moment, curiosity gets the better of her. "Sorry, I don't mean to pry, but how do you get it back in?" The bartender grins and says, "That's what the tongs are for." So two young guys appear in court after being arrested for smoking dope. The judge says, "You seem like nice young men, and I'd like to give you a second chance instead of jail time. I want you to go out this weekend and try to convince others of the evils of drug use. I'll see you back in court Monday." On Monday, the judge asks the first guy, How did you do over the weekend? Well, Your Honor, I persuaded 17 people to give up drugs forever, answers the guy. 17 people? That's wonderful. How did you do it? Asks the judge. The guy says, I used a diagram, Your Honor. I drew 2 circles, a small and a big one. Then I told them that the big circle is your brain before drugs, and the small circle is your brain after drugs. That's admirable, says the judge. Then he turns to the second guy. And how did you do? Well, Your Honor, I persuaded 156 people to give up drugs forever. Wow, says the judge. 156 people? How did you manage to do that? Well, I used a similar diagram, the guy says. I also drew 2 circles, a small and a big one. Then I pointed to the little circle and said, this is your butt before prison.
So a man entered a bar that was advertising for a bouncer. He went up to the bartender and asked, "Has that bouncer position been filled?" "Not yet," said the bartender. "Do you have any experience?" "Well, no," said the man. "But watch this." He walked over and picked up an obviously drunk patron and threw him right out of the front door. "How about that for experience?" he crowed. "Not bad," the bartender conceded, "but you'll need to talk to the boss about the job." "Okay," the man said. "Where is he?" "Well," laughed the bartender, "you just threw him out."
So, a father and son walk past a brothel, and the son asks, "Dad, what is this place?" The father replies, "It's a happy house. You can buy happiness in there." The next day, the son goes to the happy house, rings the bell, and the madam opens the door. The boy says, "Hello, I have $8 and want to buy some happiness." The madam escorts him to the kitchen and prepares 8 slices of bread with Nutella. Later that day, Dad comes home from work and finds his son exhausted on the couch and asks. His dad asks, "What's wrong?" "Son, I went to the happy house today. Best I could do was 5. The last 3, I only licked."
So, a married couple on a tight budget were shopping in a supermarket. The husband picks up a case of beer and places it in their shopping cart. The wife complained, "Put that back. We only have enough funds for essential items, not luxuries such as beer costing $20. A little later, while walking through the cosmetics aisle, the wife picks up a beauty cream and places it in the cart. The husband says, "I thought we were on a tight budget, buying only essential items, right?" The wife responds, "This item is essential. It makes me look beautiful." "Well," says the husband, "the beer also makes you look beautiful, and it's half the price of the cream."
So, the postman had been working all day in the pouring rain. He was almost finished. Apart from one last letter he had to deliver, he had to take it 2 miles down a small country road. By the time he got there, he was soaked through, muddy and sore. He entered the garden, closed the gate, and turned round to be greeted by 2 huge paws landing on his chest. There was a massive 10-stone Rottweiler standing in front of him. He was terrified. Just then the window of the house opened and a little old lady said, "Don't worry, Sonny, just kick his balls." He said, "What?" She said, "Kick his balls, he likes that." This postman had on regulation size 12 safety steel toe cap boots, 18 lace holes, and football-sized studs. He went wallop and booted the dog square in the balls. The dog went yelping and collapsed with his knees knocking together. The old lady said, "You're in big trouble now." He said, "Why?" She said, "I meant his balls on the grass beside you. You better start running." So a farmer went out one day and bought a brand new stud rooster for his chicken coop. The new rooster struts over to the old rooster and says, "Okay, old-timer, time for you to retire." The old rooster replies, "Come on, surely you can't handle all these chickens. Look what it's done to me. Can't you just let me have the 2 old hens over in the corner?" The young rooster says, "Beat it, you're washed up and I'm taking over." The old rooster says, "Tell you what, young stud, I'll race you around the farmhouse. Whoever wins gets the entire chicken coop." The young rooster laughs. "You don't stand a chance, old man. Just to be fair, I'll give you a head start." The old rooster takes off running. About 15 seconds later, the young rooster starts running after him. They round the front porch of the farmhouse, and the young rooster is closing in fast. The farmer, sitting in his usual spot on the porch, sees the roosters running by. He grabs his shotgun and boom, he blows the young rooster to bits. The farmer shakes his head sadly and says, "Darn, this is the third gay rooster I bought this month."
So, a woman was waiting for the bus. As the bus stopped and it was her turn to get on, she became aware that her skirt was too tight to allow her leg to come up to the height of the first step of the bus. Slightly embarrassed and with a quick smile to the driver, she reached behind her to unzip her skirt a little, thinking that this would give her enough slack to raise her leg. She tried to take the step, but only to discover that she couldn't. With a little smile to the driver, she again reached behind to unzip a little more, and again was unable to take the step. After becoming quite frustrated and embarrassed, she once again attempted to unzip her skirt more in order to allow more leg room to get on the first step of the bus. About this time, a large Texan who was standing behind her picked her up easily by the waist and placed her gently on the step of the bus. She went ballistic and turned to the would-be Samaritan and yelled, "How dare you touch my body? I don't even know who you are." The Texan smiled and drawled, "Well, ma'am, normally I'd agree with you, but after you unzipped my fly 3 times, I kind of figured we were friends."
So, a son and his dad walk into a bar, and the dad says to the son, "What do you want, Fathead?" The son stumbles on his words, and the father again says, "What do you want, Fathead?" A lady close by says, "Why do you keep calling your son Fathead?" And he replies, "Well, lady, there are 3 things a man has to have in his life to be a successful man. Number 1, you gotta have a big truck. See my truck over there? Biggest truck in the county. Second, you gotta have a big house. See that house down up the street? That's mine, the house, biggest house in the county. And thirdly, you have to have a hot wife with a tight opening. And I had one till this fathead came along."
So a traveling salesman finds himself in an elevator. While he's all alone, he rips a huge, stinking fart. He quickly opens his sales briefcase and takes out a can of air freshener and gives it a few squirts. A few moments later, a beautiful woman enters the elevator, visibly disturbed by the strong smell. "Smells nice, doesn't it? It's a special blend of pine wood," says the salesman. The woman looks at him with disgust and says, "It smells like someone just shit out a Christmas tree."
So 2 friends are talking one night. One says to the other, "You know what? I'm going to sell my house, buy a boat, take women out into the middle of the ocean, and tell them they either give me some or they're swimming to shore." After a few months, the friends get together again, and one asks the other how his plan worked out. The friend says, "Well, it was working out great. I sold my house, bought the boat, and the first week I had this beautiful blonde on it. I took her out to the middle of the ocean and told her she either gives me some or she's swimming back to shore, so she gives it up. Then, a couple of weeks later, I had this gorgeous brunette on the boat. I take her out to the middle of the ocean and tell her she either gives me some or she's swimming back to shore, so she gives it up. Then, a couple of weeks after that, I had this bomb-ass redhead on the boat. I take her out to the middle of the ocean and tell her she either gives me some or she's swimming back to shore. And you know what she does?
She pulls down her pants and pulls out the biggest manhood I've ever seen and says, "No, you're gonna give me some ass, or you're swimming." His friend, looking dumbfounded, asks, "So what did you do?" "Damn it, you know I can't swim."
So, an Australian man was having coffee and croissants with butter and jam in a cafe when an American tourist, chewing gum, sat down next to him. The Australian politely ignored the American, who nevertheless started up a conversation. The American snapped his gum and said, "You Australian folk eat the whole piece of bread." The Australian frowned, annoyed with being bothered during his breakfast, and replied, "Of course." The American blew a huge bubble. "We don't. In the States, we only eat what's inside. The crusts we collect in a container, recycle them, transform them into croissants, and sell them to Australia." The American had a smirk on his face. The Australian listened in silence. The American persisted. "Do you eat jam with the bread?" Sighing, the Australian replied, "Of course." Cracking his gum between his teeth, the American said, "We don't. In the States, we eat fresh fruit for breakfast. Then we put all the peels, seeds, and leftovers in containers, recycle them, transform them into jam, and sell it to Australia." The Australian then asked, "Do you make love in the States?" The American smiled and said, "Why, of course we do." The Australian leaned closer to him and asked, "And what do you do with the rubbers once you've used them?" "We throw them away, of course." The Australian, smiling, replied, "We don't. In Australia, we put them in a container, recycle them, melt them down, and turn them into chewing gum and sell them to the United States."
So, a truck driver, having been on the road for 2 weeks, stops at a brothel just outside Atlanta. He approaches the madam, pulls out $500, and says, "I want your ugliest woman and a grilled cheese sandwich." The madam, astonished, replies, "But sir, for that kind of money you could have one of my finest ladies and a 3-course meal." The trucker shakes his head and says, "Listen, darling, I'm not horny. I'm homesick." So 2 guys in a life raft in the middle of the ocean. One sees an old bottle floating. He picks it up and rubs it, and a genie comes out. The genie says, "For letting me out, I will grant you 1 wish." The guy says, "Turn this ocean into beer." And the ocean turns into the best beer anybody has ever tasted. The second guy says to the first, "You idiot! Now we'll have to piss in the boat."
So Paddy was on his deathbed and knew the end was near. His nurse, his wife, his daughter, and 2 sons are with him at his home in Belfast. He asks for 2 independent witnesses to be present and a camcorder be in place to record his last wishes. When all is ready, he begins to speak. "My son Seamus, I want you to take the houses in Cultra Estate. My daughter Geraldine, you take the apartments over in Malone Road. My son Patrick Jr., I want you to take the offices in the city center. Bridget, my dear wife, please take all the residential properties on the Upper Lisburn Road." The nurse and witnesses are blown away. They did not realize the extent of Paddy's wealth. As he slips away, the nurse says to his wife, "My deepest condolences. Your husband must have been such a hard-working and wonderful man to have accumulated all this property." "Property?" his wife replies. "The bastard was a window cleaner."
So a Brit lands in Sydney and is waiting at passport control. His turn comes and he steps to the agent. The agent asks his name and the Brit gives it. The agent asks his occupation and the Brit gives it. The agent asks, "Have you ever been convicted of a crime?" The Brit responds, "Wait, that's still a requirement?"
So a gambler calls his tax attorney, and they go to see the IRS agent. As they are waiting in the office, the IRS agent looks over his paperwork and says, "The reason for your audit is that you have a relatively lavish lifestyle, but not much income to justify it. Can you tell me what you do for a living?" The gambler says, "I am a professional gambler." "A gambler?" said the IRS agent with a slightly puzzled and surprised look on his face. "Yes, I make my money by betting. Would you like a demonstration?" "Sure," said the IRS agent. "Let's have a demonstration." "I will bet you $1,000 that I can bite my eye," said the gambler. "Okay, you have a bet," replied the IRS agent with a smirk on his face. The gambler pops out his glass eye and bites it. IRS agent is shocked as he did not see that coming, and he did agree to a $1,000 bet from a gambler's attorney. All right, this was not really fair," said the gambler. "I will give you a chance to win your money back. I will bet you another $1,000 that I can bite my other eye." IRS agent looks over the guy's paperwork and see that he is not legally blind and takes the bet. The gambler takes out his dentures and bites his other eye. The IRS agent is now visibly stressed and sweating from being on the hook for $2,000. "I tell you what, double or nothing. I will stand on the edge of your desk, close my eyes, and piss into the garbage can on the other side of the room without spilling a drop. What do you say?" The IRS agent is a little perplexed, but does not see how that would be possible and takes the bet. The gambler stands on the agent's desk, unzips his pants, closes his eyes, and pisses all over the agent's desk. "Yes!" exclaimed the IRS agent, knowing he won the bet and does not owe the gambler any money. Shit," said the attorney. "What's the matter?" asked the IRS agent. "Well, he bet me $20,000 that he will come to your office today, piss all over your desk, and you would be happy about it."
So recently, over 200 dead crows were found near Ceduna, South Australia, and there was some concern that they might have died from avian flu. A bird pathologist was called in to examine the remains, and after a thorough investigation, he confirmed that the crows had not died from avian flu, which was a relief to everyone. However, he discovered something interesting. 98% of the crows had been killed by impact with large trucks, while only 2% were hit by cars. Curious about this, the state hired an ornithological behaviorist to figure out why so many more crows were being hit by trucks than by cars. It didn't take long for the expert to come to a conclusion. He explained that when crows feed on roadkill, they always post a lookout crow in a nearby tree to warn of approaching danger. The problem? The lookout crow could say "ka," but he couldn't say "truck." So, after Quasimodo's death, the Bishop of Notre Dame announced that a new bell ringer was needed. Determined to find the right person, he decided to conduct the interviews himself and went up into the belfry to begin the screening process. After observing several applicants demonstrate their skills, the bishop was about to call it a day when a lone, armless man approached him and declared he wanted to apply for the job. The bishop was incredulous. "You have no arms." "No matter," said the man, "just watch." He then began striking the bells with his face, producing a beautiful melody on the carillon. The bishop listened in astonishment, convinced he had finally found a worthy replacement for Quasimodo. Suddenly, while rushing forward to strike a bell, the armless man tripped and plunged headlong out of the belfry window to his death on the street below. The stunned bishop hurried down the stairs. When he reached the street,
A crowd had gathered around the fallen figure, drawn by the beautiful music they had heard moments before. As they parted to let the bishop through, one of them asked, "Bishop, who was this man?" "I don't know his name," the bishop sadly replied, "but his face rings a bell."
So, once upon a time, a loving couple lived in a small town. The wife, a successful businesswoman, was invited to a prestigious conference in Italy. Excited and a bit nervous about her trip, she and her husband prepared everything carefully, making sure she had everything she needed. On the day of her departure, her husband drove her to the airport as the sun was setting on the horizon. As they reached the terminal, she turned to him, her eyes filled with gratitude and love. "Thank you for your support, honey," she says. "Is there anything special you'd like me to bring back for you from Italy?" Her husband teasingly replies, "How about an Italian girl?" The wife just shakes her head, not amused by her husband's request, and then boards her flight. When the conference is over, her husband eagerly awaits her return at the airport. As they embrace, he asks, "How was your trip, sweetheart?" "Very good," she replies with a warm smile. "And what happened to my present?" "What present?" she asked him. "The one I asked for, an Italian girl." The wife grins and says, "Oh, that. I did the best I could under the circumstances. We'll just have to wait 9 months to see if it's a girl."
Two teenage male friends named Bob and Jim go on a cross-country road trip. And while they're in Colorado, they get stuck in a massive blizzard. They happen to find a huge house and they knock on the door. A beautiful woman in her 30s answers the door, invites them in, and shows them to separate bedrooms. The next morning, she cooks them breakfast, and they resume their trip without ever exchanging names. They remain friends, and 30 years later, Bob calls Jim and asks, "Hey man, do you remember that cross-country road trip we took 30 years ago?" Jim replies, "Yeah man, we had a blast." Bob says, "That we did. How about that one night when we got stuck in that blizzard and that beautiful woman invited us into her house for the night?" Jim is quiet for a few seconds and says, "I think remember that. What about it? Did you go into the woman's bedroom during the night and screw with her, then give her my name and contact info?" Jim comes clean. "Yeah, I did, man. I'm sorry, but I had a serious girlfriend at the time and you didn't, so I gave her your info." Bob joyfully says, "No worries, man. She just died and left me $10 million. Thanks, bro."
So, the wrestling match was about to begin, and the contender's coach was once again lecturing the contender. "If I've told you once, I've told you 1,000 times, don't let the champion get you in the pretzel. No one has ever been able to get out of the pretzel." The contender nodded his head, getting ready for the match. "I know, coach. If you've told me once, I won't let him get me in the pretzel." "Good. Just don't let him get you in the pretzel." The crowd in the arena was roaring. The two wrestlers moved to ring, a well-lit white square in the center of the seats. The contender was called, and the crowd cheered. Then the champion was called, and the crowd roared. Coach called to the contender, "Don't let him get you in the pretzel." And the contender nodded and moved into the center. After a few moments, the match began. Coach watched as the wrestlers twisted together, all power and speed. The crowd surged. The bodies on the mat became a twisted wreck. "The pretzel," the coach whispered, reaching to throw the towel into the ring, knowing there was no way the contender could win. Before he could, though, there was a horrible, wrenching scream of agony from the ring. The wrestlers parted, fought, and before anyone could react, the contender had the champion pinned. The count went down. There was a new champion. Coach's jaw was on the ground, the towel still in his hand. He was amazed, shocked.
The new champion was hustled into the locker room, and coach followed. How did you do that? No one has ever got out of the pretzel. Never. Well, coach, if you've told me once, you've told me 1,000 times. But he is really good. I thought I had everything under control, but he was so fast. Before I knew it, he had me in the pretzel, and I heard the count going down. I couldn't move. I looked up, and there was a groin hanging right in front of my face, and I figured I had nothing to lose, so I chomped on it as hard as I could. You can't believe the strength you get from biting your own testicles.
So, a drunk stumbles along a Sunday afternoon baptismal service down by the river. He proceeds to walk down into the water and stands next to the preacher. The minister turns and notices the old drunk and says, "Mister, are you ready to find Jesus?" The drunk looks back and says, "Yes, preacher, I sure am." The minister then dunks the fellow under the water and pulls him right back up. "Have you found Jesus?" the preacher asks. "No, I didn't," replies the drunk. The preacher then dunks him under for quite a bit longer, brings him up and asks, "Now, brother, have you found Jesus?" "No, I did not, Reverend." The preacher, in disgust, holds the man under for at least 30 seconds this time, then brings him out of the water and asks in a harsh tone, "My God, have you found Jesus yet?" The old drunk wipes his eyes and asks the preacher, "Are you sure this is where he fell in?"
So a husband was feeling sorry for himself, and in a rare moment of candor confessed to his wife, "Sometimes I think I'm nothing but an idiot." His wife held his hand tenderly and said, "Don't worry, darling. Lots of people feel like that. In fact, virtually everyone we know thinks you're an idiot."
So, one evening, an usher at a posh Texas theater noticed a drunken cowboy sprawled across 3 seats. The usher approached and tapped the cowboy's boot with his flashlight. "Excuse me, sir, but you're only allowed 1 seat," the usher said. The cowboy groaned, but didn't budge. "Sir," the usher insisted, "if you don't move, I'll have to get the manager." The cowboy groaned again, wiggling one hand, but still didn't move. Frustrated, the usher went to get the manager. Together, they tried to get the cowboy to move, but he just moaned and stayed put. Finally, fed up, the manager called the police. The officer arrived, listened to the situation, and then grabbed the cowboy's shoulder, giving him a slight shake. "All right, buddy, what's your name?" the officer asked. "Steve," the cowboy groaned. "And where are you from, Steve?" the officer asked, trying to reason with him. Steve let out another groan, pointed weakly upwards, and said, "The balcony." So, a family is eating ham for dinner. The daughter notices that every time she makes ham, she always cuts each end off. She says, "Every time we have ham, you always cut each end off. Is there a reason you always cut the ends off?" The mother responds, "It's something I learned from watching my mother." The next day, the mother calls her own mother and asks why this was. She says, "I noticed that every time we would have ham, you always cut each end off. Is there a reason you always cut the ends off?" She responds, "It's something I learned from watching my mother." The next day, she goes over to visit her grandmother. She says, "My mother said that every time you cooked ham, you always cut each end off. Is there a reason you always cut the ends off?" She responds, "It's something I learned from watching my mother." The next day, she goes over to the nursing home to visit her great-grandmother. She says, "My mother and grandma said that every time you cooked ham, you always cut each end off. Is there a reason you always cut the ends off?" She responds, "So it could fit in my pan."
So, a young man was lost, wandering in a forest, when he came upon a small house. He knocked on the door and was greeted by an ancient Chinese man with a long, gray beard. "I'm lost," said the man. "Can you put me up for the night?" "Certainly," the Chinese man said, "but on one condition. If you so much as lay a finger on my daughter, I will inflict upon you the 3 worst Chinese tortures known to man." "Okay," said the man, thinking that the daughter must be pretty old as well, and entered the house. Before dinner, the daughter came down the stairs. She was young, beautiful, and had a fantastic figure. She was obviously attracted to the young man since she couldn't keep her eyes off him during the meal. Remembering the old man's warning, he ignored her and went up to bed alone. But during the night, he could bear it no longer and sneaked into her room for a night of passion. He was careful to keep everything quiet so the old man wouldn't hear. Near dawn, he crept back to his room, exhausted but happy. He woke in the morning with the feel of pressure on his chest. Opening his eyes, he saw a large rock on his chest with a note on it that read, "Chinese Torture 1, large rock on chest." Well, that's pretty crappy, he thought. If that's the best the old man can do, then I don't have much to worry about. He picked the boulder up, walked over to the window, and threw the boulder out. As he did so, he noticed another note on it that read, "Chinese Torture 2, rock tied to left testicle." In a panic, he glanced down and saw the rope that was already getting close to the end. Figuring that a few broken bones was better than castration, he jumped out of the window after the boulder. As he plummeted downward, he saw a large sign on the ground that read, "Chinese Torture 3, right testicle tied to bedpost."
So a man goes for a walk in the park. On his walk, he sees 2 men sitting on a park bench and looking very down. "What's wrong?" he asked them. One of the men looks up at the man and lets out a long sigh. "Take a seat and I'll tell you." Curious, he sits down next to the 2 men. "The paint's wet," the man says.
So, a very frugal old man worked hard his entire life and saved every penny possible. He decided that because he put so much effort into it, he wanted to die with all his money. The old man made his wife promise to bury him with every cent to his name. Finally, the day came and the old man died. At the funeral, as they were about to close the casket for the final time, his wife yelled out, "Wait just a minute." She walked over to the casket and placed a locked box inside with her husband. A friend next to her asked, "My goodness, did you really put all his money in the casket?" The wife said, "Yes, I gathered it all in my bank account and wrote him a check for the entire amount."
So a father is driving his son to his first day of school. The boy looks worried, so his dad asks him, "What's wrong?" The kid asks his father nervously, "How long do I have to go to school for?" "Until you're 18, says the father. The boy nods quietly. When they get to the front of the school, he asks, "Daddy, can you please give my puppy a hug for me?" "You can hug him when you get home, son," says the father. "Well, can you please give mommy a big hug for me?" "Son," the father says abruptly, "you can hug her when you get home." The boy's eyes get watery and he starts to sniff. So the father adds, "Don't worry so much. You'll be fine. Go on now." The boy nods and wipes his nose. "Daddy, can I ask one more question?" "Go on," says the dad. The boy, now very teary-eyed, says, "Daddy, you will remember to come get me when I'm 18, won't you?"
So, a lawyer, a priest, and a young schoolboy were flying in a small plane when suddenly it started to go down. There were only 2 parachutes on board. The lawyer, being convinced that he was the smartest person on the plane and therefore deserved to live, quickly grabbed a parachute and jumped out without hesitation. The priest, knowing he had lived a long and fulfilling life, turned to the young boy and said, "My child, you take the last parachute. You have your whole life ahead of you." But the boy just smiled and said, "Don't worry, father. We both have a parachute. That clever lawyer just jumped out with my school bag."
So it was a dark and stormy night, outside a little town in Mexico. This guy was on the side of the road hitchhiking on a very dark night and in the middle of a storm. As the night descended and no cars passed by, the storm became stronger, so he could hardly see a few feet in front of him. Suddenly, he saw a car coming towards him and stop. The guy, without thinking, got in the car, closes the door, and just realizes there's nobody behind the wheel. The car starts slowly. The guy looks at the road and sees a curve coming his way. Scared, he starts to pray, begging for his life. Then, just before he hits the curve, a hand appears through the window and steers the wheel into the curve. The guy, paralyzed with fear, watched how the hand appears every time they are coming to a curve. The guy, gathering strength, jumps out of the car and runs to the nearest town. Wet and in shock, he goes to a cantina and asks for 2 shots of tequila and starts telling everybody about the horrible experience he endured. A silence enveloped everybody when they realized the guy was crying and wasn't drunk. About half an hour later, 2 guys walked inside the same cantina, and one said to the other, "Look, Paco, that's the gringo that got in the car when we were pushing it."
So John strolls into the bar looking like he's carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. The bartender, being the curious type, asks him what's got him feeling so down. John replies with a sigh, "Well, you know, there are just some things you can't explain." The bartender, ever the optimist, urges him to spill the beans, thinking it might lighten his mood. John starts recounting his morning woes about how he was in the barn trying to milk the cow when, lo and behold, she decides to kick the bucket over with her hoof. "Just some things you can't explain," John says, shaking his head. The bartender, intrigued, asks how he handled the situation. John, without missing a beat, explains how he tied the cow's leg to a post with a piece of rope. "But," he adds, "just some things you can't explain." Undeterred, John resumes milking, only to have the cow kick the bucket over again, this time with the other hoof. "You guessed it," John says, "just some things you can't explain." So he ties her other hoof to another post with more rope. "But," he repeats, "just some things you can't explain." Now you'd think that would solve the problem, right? Wrong. Just as John's about to fill the bucket halfway, the cow decides to swat it away with her tail. "And you know what?" John says, "just some things you can't explain." Running out of options, John uses his belt to tie the cow's tail to a rafter. "But," he continues, "just then my pants fall down." And then John concludes with a sheepish grin. "My wife walks in and, well, just some things you can't explain."
So it has been scientifically proven that if we drink 1 liter of water each day, at the end of the year, we would have absorbed more than 1 kilo of Escherichia coli bacteria found in water that contains feces. In other words, we are consuming 1 kilo of shit. However, we do not run that risk when drinking rum, gin, whiskey, wine, or other liquors, because alcohol has to go through a distillation process of boiling, filtering, and fermentation. It is my duty to communicate to all of you people who are drinking water to stop doing so. It has been scientifically proven that it is unhealthy and bad for you. Therefore, it is better to drink alcohol and talk shit than to drink water and be full of it. So, this park ranger is doing his rounds in the woods when he stumbles upon a guy sitting by a fire, his rifle leaning against a tree, roasting a bald eagle. The ranger immediately arrests the guy and drags him to his cruiser. Eventually, the case goes to court. The judge is outraged and asks if he has anything to say for himself before going to jail. The guy explains that he was lost in the woods for several days, could not find anything to eat. When he was almost starved to death, he sees the eagle perched in a tree close by. It was purely a matter of survival. He gathered whatever strength he had left, shot the bird, and was eating it when the rangers showed up and arrested him. The judge was understanding, opted for leniency, and let him go free. As he's exiting the court, the judge calls him and asks,
So a fellow
out of curiosity,
decided to decorate
how does it
his
taste?
bedroom.
And the guy
He wasn't
responds,
sure how many rolls
it's a
of
very
wallpaper
interesting
he
flavor.
But he
I'd
knew
say
that the
something
Irishman
between
who
a
lived
panda
next
bear
door had
and an
recently
Andean
done the
condor.
same job, and the two rooms were identical
A
in
guy
size.
walks into a pet
Murphy,
store
he asked,
and sees
how
3
many
cages,
rolls of wallpaper
each
did you
containing
buy
a
for your
monkey
bedroom?
dressed in a
10,
police uniform.
said Murphy.
The first
So the
cage
fellow bought
had
the
a
10 rolls of
$500
paper
price
and
tag
did
on
the
it.
job.
The second
It looked
cage
wonderful,
had a
but he had
$1,000
two
price tag on
rolls
it.
of wallpaper
And the
left
third
over.
cage had a
Murphy,
$5,000 price tag
I
on
bought
it.
10 rolls
The
of
guy
wallpaper
points
for
at
the
the
bedroom,
first cage
but I've
and
got 2
asks the
left
proprietor
over.
about it.
That's
The
funny,
proprietor
said
tells
Murphy.
him, "This
So did
is
I.
our officer model police monkey. He knows all the state statutes, is qualified with a Glock, and writes great reports, a great value for $500. Then the guy points at the second cage and asks the proprietor about that one. The proprietor tells him, "This is our sergeant model police monkey. He can supervise up to 5 officer model police monkeys. He's qualified as a range officer, and he can teach arrest defense tactics, a great value for $1,000. Finally, the guy points at the third cage, the one with the $5,000 price tag on it, and asks the proprietor about that one. The proprietor tells him, "This is our lieutenant model police monkey," but offers no further explanation. The guy asks, "So what does he do?" The proprietor sheepishly replies, "Well, sir, we've never actually seen him do anything." So, a police officer pulls over a guy who's swerving between lanes. Approaching the car, the officer says, "Sir, I'm going to need you to blow into this breathalyzer." The man replies, "I can't do that, officer. I'm asthmatic. Blowing into that could trigger a serious asthma attack." "All right," the officer says, "then we'll need you to come to the station and provide a blood sample." "Sorry, I can't do that either. I'm a hemophiliac. If you take my blood, I could bleed to death." Frustrated, the officer says, "Fine, then I'll need a urine sample." The man shakes his head. "I can't do that, officer. I'm diabetic, and that could cause my blood sugar to crash." The officer, now exasperated, says, "Well, can you at least step out of the car and walk this straight line?" The man sighs and admits, "I can't do that either." "Why not?" the officer asks. The guy smiles and replies, "Because I'm drunk."
So a fellow decided to decorate his bedroom. He wasn't sure how many rolls of wallpaper he would need, but he knew that the Irishman who lived next door had recently done the same job, and the 2 rooms were identical in size. "Murphy," he asked, "how many rolls of wallpaper did you buy for your bedroom?" 10, said Murphy. So the fellow bought the 10 rolls of paper and did the job. It looked wonderful, but he had 2 rolls of wallpaper left over. "Murphy," he said, "I bought 10 rolls of wallpaper for the bedroom, but I've got 2 left over." "That's funny," said Murphy. "So did I."
So 2 guys were at a rooftop bar when they got into an argument. The first guy bet the second guy $1,000 that he could jump off the building and be blown back up to the ledge by the giant air conditioners just below. The second guy thought he was crazy and told him he'd surely kill himself. But the first guy insisted, even offering 10-to-1 odds on the bet. Finally, the second guy shrugged and said, "Okay, you're on, your funeral." With a quick handshake to seal the deal, the first guy leaped off the building.
As he approached the giant air conditioners, he slowed down, then was accelerated back up to the ledge where he landed smoothly. The second guy was in shock. "No way!" he exclaimed. The first guy gestured to the ledge. "See for yourself. If you can land back on the ledge as smoothly as I did, we'll call the bet off. Otherwise, you owe me double." The second guy, full of drunken courage, decided to try it. He jumped, but instead of being blown back up, he plummeted past the air conditioners and met an early demise. The bartender looked over at the first guy, sighed, and said, "Damn it, Superman, you're really mean when you're drunk."
So, 4 university students partied too hard during a music festival and were unable to make it back for their final exam the next day. As they drove back to the university, they tried to think of a good excuse. Finally, they agreed to the same story, that a car tire was blown in the middle of nowhere at midnight, so they were stuck. They each sent the professor an email asking to retake the exam and gave the same excuse. The understanding professor said it was fine and asked them to take the exam the next day, but for fairness, they would have to take a different exam. The next day, they came to the exam room, and as per the usual procedure, each obtained a copy of the exam and sat in a corner. The classroom was big and empty. The professor sat and watched them, so they were nervous. Fortunately, the questions on the first page are fairly easy. Even though these questions only worth 10 out of 100 points, it calmed them down a bit. So they quickly finished the first page at the same time and turned to the second page. There was a single question on it, for 90 out of 100 points. Which tire was blown?
So a boy goes to the zoo with his parents. They're standing at the elephant exhibit when he asks his mom, "What's that thing hanging down from the elephant?" Mom glances over and says, "That's its trunk." The boy shakes his head. "No, further back." Mom looks again. "Oh, that's its tail." The boy, still not satisfied, says, "No, in between." Mom, a bit flustered, quickly responds, "Oh, that's nothing. Now run along." Still curious, the boy walks over to his dad and asks, "Dad, what's that thing hanging down from the elephant?" Dad says, "That's its trunk." The boy repeats, "No, further back." Dad replies, "That's its tail." The boy persists, "No, in between." Dad finally says, "That's its manhood, son." The boy, puzzled, says, "But Mom said it was nothing." Dad chuckles and replies, "Well, son, you have to realize that your mom is a little spoiled." So George walks up to Terry bruised, battered, and covered in blood. Terry asks what the hell happened to him. He says, "I'm just walking along, minding my own business, and this horse comes out of nowhere and knocks me down." That explains it. "Let me call you an ambulance," says Terry. George says, "Hold on, I haven't finished yet." So I get up, dust myself down, and wouldn't you know it, I get knocked down by a car. "Oh my God, it's a miracle you're still alive. I'll call an ambulance," says Terry. George says, "Hold on, I still haven't finished." I get up, dust myself down again. I've now got a few cuts and bruises. I catch my breath and I get knocked down by an ambulance. Terry says, "That's it, I'm calling the emergency services." George says, "Wait, I still haven't finished. Somehow I survived." I get up, I'm feeling groggy, but then I get hit by a fire truck. I get up swaying side to side. Then a helicopter crashes into me. Terry say, "It's a miracle that you're still alive, so what happened then?" The carny operator kicked me off the carousel.